Good evening, my friends. The proposed three-team trade involving the Pittsburgh Steelers has generated plenty of discussion, but once you break down every detail, it becomes very difficult to find any realistic scenario where this deal would actually benefit Pittsburgh. The idea suggests the Steelers would move DK Metcalf while receiving Brandon Aiyuk along with a 2027 third-round pick. At first glance, adding another talented receiver may sound intriguing, but when you examine the current situation surrounding both players, the entire proposal quickly falls apart. The biggest reason is simple. The Steelers have already committed themselves to winning right now. This is not a rebuilding football team looking to collect future draft capital or reshuffle its roster for the long term. Every major decision made throughout this offseason points toward competing immediately. Trading away your number one wide receiver after building the offense around him would completely contradict everything the organization has worked toward. DK Metcalf is expected to be one of the centerpieces of Pittsburgh's passing attack. Moving him now would not only weaken the offense, but would also send a confusing message inside the locker room. When a franchise declares that its goal is to compete immediately, you simply don't trade away your top receiving weapon before the season even begins. Then there is the Brandon Aiyuk side of this proposal, and that raises even more questions. The Steelers already attempted to acquire Aiyuk during the 2024 offseason. At that time, Pittsburgh reportedly had the framework of a trade ready and was even prepared to offer him a contract comparable to what they later gave DK Metcalf. Instead of accepting that opportunity, Aiyuk chose to remain with San Francisco, leaving the Steelers without the receiver they had spent months pursuing. That decision forced Pittsburgh into a completely different direction offensively, and according to the information available in this report, the organization has little reason to revisit that situation now. The circumstances surrounding Aiyuk have also become significantly more complicated. He has not played in an NFL game since suffering his injury, and his availability remains surrounded by uncertainty. The report also points out additional issues regarding his rehabilitation process, including missed team requirements that reportedly allowed San Francisco to void guaranteed money in his contract. On top of that, he eventually stopped reporting to the team, leading to placement on the NFL reserved or left squad list, where he reportedly remains because he has not yet filed for reinstatement. Those are not minor concerns. The Steelers would essentially be giving up a healthy, proven number one receiver for a player whose football future is surrounded by uncertainty. Even before discussing talent, availability is one of the most valuable traits any NFL player can have. Pittsburgh would be taking on enormous financial risk while also creating uncertainty at one of the most important positions on the roster. Another point raised is Aiyuk's reported preference regarding where he wants to continue his career. According to the information presented, he has made it clear that Washington is the destination he prefers, not Pittsburgh. If that remains the case, it becomes even harder to imagine why the Steelers would aggressively pursue a trade for a player who may not even want to be part of their organization. When you combine the injury concerns, contract situation, previous negotiations, and reported preferred destination, it becomes increasingly difficult to identify a single advantage for Pittsburgh in this proposal. Sometimes off-season trade ideas generate excitement simply because they involve big names. Three-team trades especially tend to attract attention because they look creative on paper, but the NFL is not the NBA. Multi-team trades are extremely uncommon, especially this late in the offseason, and every organization involved has to believe it is improving its own position. From Pittsburgh's perspective, this proposal accomplishes the exact opposite. The Steelers would weaken the offense, introduce uncertainty at wide receiver, assume significant financial risk, and move away from the very identity they have built throughout the offseason. While that proposal appears highly unrealistic, another situation developing around the league could actually create a more believable opportunity for Pittsburgh. Following Detroit's decision to release Terrion Arnold, the Lions suddenly have a significant question at cornerback. That immediately raises the possibility that Detroit could explore the trade market before the regular season begins, and Pittsburgh happens to be one of the teams with considerable depth at the position. The Steelers currently have multiple cornerbacks capable of contributing, including Joey Porter Jr., Jamel Dean, Jalen Ramsey, Brandon Eccles, Asante Samuel Jr., and rookie Dalen Everett. Having that much depth naturally opens the door for discussions if another team becomes desperate before week 1. However, that does not mean Pittsburgh should entertain offers for everyone. Moving Joey Porter Jr. simply because another team offers premium draft compensation may sound attractive in theory, but once again, it conflicts with the Steelers' current objective. A future first-round pick does nothing to help this football team win games this season. If the franchise truly believes it has assembled a roster capable of competing immediately, sacrificing one one of its starting cornerbacks for future assets would be extremely difficult to justify. Instead, if Detroit were to call Pittsburgh, the much more logical conversation would involve one of the backup cornerbacks currently competing for playing time. That creates an interesting question heading into training camp. With Pittsburgh possessing legitimate depth in the secondary and Detroit potentially searching for immediate help, could the Steelers quietly turn one of their reserve cornerbacks into valuable draft capital without hurting their chances of winning this season, or is keeping every experienced defensive back the smarter move once the regular season begins? If Pittsburgh decides to make a move before the regular season, the most realistic path is not a blockbuster trade involving star players. Instead, it would likely involve maximizing the value of the depth they have already built, particularly at cornerback. With several experienced defensive backs competing for snaps, the Steelers are one of the few teams that could realistically afford to move a reserve player if another franchise becomes desperate. Among the names mentioned, Asante Samuel Jr. appears to be the most logical candidate if the front office chooses to explore the market. The reasoning is straightforward. While Samuel has proven throughout his career that he can be a capable starting outside cornerback, Pittsburgh currently has multiple players projected ahead of him. That makes him a valuable insurance policy, but it also means his role could become limited if everyone remains healthy. Brandon Echols presents a different situation. His versatility gives the Steelers additional flexibility throughout the season because he has experience lining up in multiple spots across the secondary. Injuries are inevitable during an NFL season, and having someone capable of moving between outside corner and the slot carries significant value. That positional flexibility could make Echols more difficult to replace internally than Samuel, even if Samuel may have the stronger resume as a pure outside corner. Because both players are currently on one-year contracts, Pittsburgh is not making a long-term commitment to either one. That allows the front office to evaluate the market purely from a football perspective. If another team is willing to offer worthwhile compensation for a player who projects as a backup, it becomes a conversation worth having. The report even suggests a reasonable example. If Detroit were willing to offer a 5th-round draft pick in exchange for Asante Samuel Jr., that could represent solid value for a player who is not expected to open the season as one of Pittsburgh's primary starters. It would allow the Steelers to add future draft capital without significantly disrupting the structure of their defense. Of course, none of that means Pittsburgh is actively looking to make a trade. Quite the opposite. Because of the depth they currently possess, the Steelers are in the advantageous position of setting the price rather than feeling pressure to complete a deal. If another team becomes aggressive enough to meet that asking price, Pittsburgh can listen. If not, they can comfortably enter the season with one of the deepest cornerback groups on the roster. That brings us to another major topic that deserves a closer look. The trade that sent Minkah Fitzpatrick to Miami while bringing Jaylen Ramsey and Jonnu Smith to Pittsburgh. More than a year has now passed since that deal was completed, making this a good opportunity to evaluate how it has unfolded. Looking strictly at last season, there is a fair argument that the Steelers did not receive the immediate impact they were hoping for. The biggest issue was how the roster evolved throughout the year. Pittsburgh eventually found itself searching for stability at free safety, a position Minkah Fitzpatrick had occupied at an elite level for years. Instead of having one of the NFL's most accomplished free safeties available, the Steelers were forced to use Jaylen Ramsey in that role for much of the second half of the season. Ramsey handled the assignment professionally, but it was never the position where he was expected to provide his greatest value. Before arriving in Pittsburgh, he had not regularly played safety since his college days. Asking him to make that transition during the middle of an NFL season naturally limited some of the unique skills that made him such an attractive acquisition in the first place. Meanwhile, Minkah Fitzpatrick quietly put together a productive season in Miami. According to the report, he spent much of the year playing in the Dolphins' nickel packages instead of operating as a traditional deep safety. Even so, his experience and versatility may have addressed one of Pittsburgh's biggest defensive needs as the season unfolded. Because of that, it's understandable why some people believe the Steelers may have moved on from Fitzpatrick a little too early. Looking only at last season, there is certainly an argument that keeping him could have helped stabilize the secondary during several difficult stretches. However, evaluating this trade requires looking beyond only one season. The Steelers acquired Jaylen Ramsey because they believe his best football can still help transform their defense, particularly in the role they envision for him moving forward. Instead of asking him to play deep safety, Pittsburgh appears ready to use Ramsey primarily as a big nickel defender, a position that allows him to take advantage of nearly every strength that has defined his career. His physicality against the run, his willingness to take on blockers, his instincts in coverage, his ability to blitz, and his versatility all become much more more valuable near the line of scrimmage than when asking him to patrol the deep middle of the field every snap. That role also fits perfectly with the defensive structure Pittsburgh wants to build. The Steelers want to show offenses two high safety looks before the snap, creating uncertainty for opposing quarterbacks. In order to make that system work consistently, the slot defender has to function almost like an extra linebacker at times, while still possessing the coverage skills to defend receivers in space. Few defensive backs possess that combination of size, instincts, and experience as naturally as Jaylen Ramsey. At approximately 210 pounds with outstanding physicality and long arms, Ramsey has the profile to thrive in exactly that assignment. Early in his time with Pittsburgh, before moving into the safety role, he reportedly demonstrated just how effective he could be playing inside. Those performances offered a glimpse of what the Steelers hope to see over the course of an entire season once he is allowed to remain in his natural position. That is why, despite some understandable criticism surrounding the trade after last season, the organization still has every reason to believe the long-term outcome could look very different. If Jaylen Ramsey performs at the level Pittsburgh expects in this defense,